Okay, all right. Well, it is our pleasure to welcome today Adrian Hampton, who is coming to us from the Decolonial River Coalition. And we're really excited to have Adrian here for a number of reasons, but the absolute best reason that I can think of that I'm excited to have Adrian here is that for many years, Adrian worked here in the program in the environment as one of our student staff members. Adrian is herself a graduate of the program on the environment, and Adrian used to sit, there used to be a desk out here in the front and Adrian would sit at that desk and welcome people. And I still am so fond of this times when I would come in the office and this cheerful young person would greet me, and it was such a delight. So we're so lucky to have you back again to talk with us today. And
thanks for having me.
I'm really glad you could be here.
Likewise.
So in her current role, Adrian is a climate policy manager. So talking a lot about climate policy as it relates here within our city to work in the Duwamish River region and the restoration work that is actively going on there. So I'm pretty excited that you can talk to us about that. In the just to remind folks that we are live and we are also broadcasting online. So as we go through the talk today, you might have questions, and we really want you to ask questions. And so, Adrian, to the extent that you're capable of remembering this one thing when it gets complicated, but
Okay.
if you can remember to repeat the question, that's great. And people who are asking questions, if you can just feel empowered to speak boldly so that the folks online will be able to hear you. And that way your question doesn't have to get reframed, but you might be able to do both things. So
Okay,
we'll see.
I'll remember.
No pressure. It's kind of a lot. So the biggest thing is we're really glad you're here.
Okay,
So,
great.
thank you all for joining us. And thanks for being here. Okay.
Alrighty, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for that amazing introduction. Before I go any further, I just want to make sure we have like a virtual buddy. So Sean, is that you?
I'll be your buddy.
You'll be the virtual buddy?
Sure.
Okay, so questions that come up in the chat and that kind of thing, you'll let me know.
I'll let you know.
Okay, perfect. I'm in our hybrid world. I'm learning this new kind of facilitation technique that having a virtual buddy is really helpful. So folks online can also feel super included. So I hope you all are feeling super included. So again, my name is Adrian Hampton. I use she, her pronouns. My current kind of job position is I'm a climate policy manager at the Duwamish River Community Coalition. I'll get into that a little bit further into our time together. The goal today is just to cover a lot of ground. We're really going to go on a journey together, and I'm really hoping that you all will join me in that journey. Like climate change in general, we know is an incredibly complex issue, right? It requires complex thinking, complex problem solving. You know, it starts with us, extends into our internal spaces, our spheres of influence, and then has a ripple effect outwards, right? And there are so many people doing all sorts of things. And that can get really tricky. It can get really messy. It can get really conflicting tensions, right? And at the end of the day, there are still ways through, right? Ways to navigate through complexity to reach solutions that we know are going to, I love to say, turn the curve on the kind of issues that we know are present in front of us, right? The impacts that we know are impacting some of our most vulnerable communities and globally, right? So we're going to cover a lot of ground. And I'm really excited to do this with you all. First, we're going to get started talking about like who are we before the work actually, you know, ramps up, right? Before we dive in, who are we? I start here because to get through that complexity, I do think it requires like understanding each other. Number one, like us understanding ourselves, right? Our identity. Knowing that that's never, or at least for me, I'll speak for my own worldview, it's never rock solid, right? But we evolve and we grow. And often being rooted in that identity can really help us then move forward to that solution, right? Moving forward to that complexity. Some of us hold very complex identities. I always like to say that that makes us like really well equipped to like be uncomfortable and sit in complexity, whereas some folks who might have had various privileges due to, you know, their identity and background might not have that same kind of like gusto, but we're going to bring them along with us. So if you could pull out maybe like a notebook or pencil or like something to kind of do some creative writing, we're going to start there. And we're just going to take 5 minutes to kind of answer this question of who are we before the work gets started. As you're getting there, I have a bunch of slides prepared for you all, and I hope you think they're really pretty because I do. But to ground us in this conversation, we're really going to be talking about health equity, and that health starts with ourselves, right? Let me just make sure I can get this going. Doesn't work. I was anything. Okay. Okay, cool. So as you're kind of getting your pen and paper ready, just to kind of set our tone, for this space, I'm going to offer, everything today is an offering, so take it or leave it, right? But to help us move through, these are my like guiding values that I offer to this conversation. These are key values I hold close in my work when I'm thinking about complex things around environmental studies, climate change, justice, etc. And so number one for me is curiosity. I'm always asking why, right? Curiosity helps us open our minds. Sometimes things can feel really tense, really defensive because there might be some closed-mindedness, right? We might be met with some closed-mindedness. And you can always ask yourself, how can you get a little bit more curious and just dig a little deeper, even if you don't want to, you know what I mean? Even if you don't want to, sometimes you'll be surprised by just being a little bit more curious. It could help you move through to get to a solution. Joy. This is really important. I do believe that we can have fun. We can bring joy into a conversation, even when it gets tough. And this is so important, especially when we talk about healing in our communities, right? Especially when we talk about a coming together, we can have joy in these spaces and talk about the hard things too. Humility. I will be the first person to admit that I don't know something. And I used to not be like that, I'll tell you. You know, sometimes we want to put up a front because we don't want to be vulnerable or show a weakness or something like that. I think that's totally valid, but in this space, we can hold multiple truths, right? Multiple things can exist at the same time. And therefore, humility asks us to kind of be humble, maybe admit that we don't know something, but it allows for space to grow. Speaking of community care, right? When we hold space for each other, it's a way that we can foster community care, right? So this room, this hall now is like our container, right? We can hold it all in here and we can care for each other by leading with curiosity, holding joy, and having humility. Another one that I didn't add on here, but I do love, I call it BYOB. It's like be your own boo. Okay, so if you need water, if you need to get up to go to the bathroom, you just take care of yourself, right? You just be your own buddy, be your own boo. Okay, so these are our guiding values, and I hope you all will join me in them. Our flow of discussion is in like two parts, and we're going to try to cover a lot of ground. So we're here. Who are we before the work gets started? Then we're going to really unpack that. Why are we talking about this and why it matters? And then we're going to talk about it. I'm going to take us through an introduction to what is called nonviolent communication, as well as decolonial. It's like actually 2 parts. So decolonial nonviolent communication. That's going to take us into a conversation around justice, right? How can we start thinking about justice within our own work, within our own studies, how we move throughout the world. And then we'll go a little bit more into environmental justice, climate change, and public health. And I'll give some supporting research. Anytime you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. We're going to work to find some common ground amongst each other since we don't know each other very well. But I am full of examples of like nitty gritty situations and ways through. So feel free to pick my brain anytime. Then we'll take just like a little pause. That's the goal. And then our part 2 is going to be kind of this like turning the curve. So how can we increase, community-led decision making to, increase our well-being, right, in this work, getting to that solution that we all dream of. And then this will end on the kind of a shared vision for the future. So it's like a lot, right? But we're going to do this, so don't fret. Okay, so who are we before the work gets started? Your prompt is really like, it's really asking yourself, like, I really just want you to ask yourself, like, who are you? Simple as, right? Or maybe not so simple. But before we talk about climate change, let's talk about our own internal climate. So for example, I think of myself, I'm a mixed race Black woman. And who am I? I'm someone who loves to talk to people, right? I am someone who needs to exercise. I love being hydrated. I love to learn, right? Think about those characteristics that make up your identity. Who are you before the work gets started? So take like maybe a minute to just jot some things down. It doesn't have to be perfect. It could be like a bullet point, and you're not going to share this out. So feel free to write it out. We do this because often we move so fast through our days that we don't actually have time to attend to ourselves and think about what we need. And we'll get to that very soon. So who are you before this work gets started? You might be thinking about like what informs your identity. I think about how I was born in upstate New York across from a church that had a secret door to the underground railroad. So for me, thinking about environment has always been connected to liberation, right? I feel innately connected. Now you'll ask yourself, what do you need to sustain yourself, to sustain your identity when the work gets started? What are those things that you need? So that's part 2. Take a minute to ask that. So kind of thinking about that characteristics of your identity that you wrote down. What do you need then when the work gets started to tend to yourself? Maybe something you need to ask from others. What do you need? And we ask this question because it keeps us grounded, right? If you're ever, I don't know, sitting in a class and maybe the conversation gets a little heated, it's really easy to kind of lose ourselves in that moment, right? Lose our groundedness. Maybe it's you need something like your values to be reflected, or you need people around you who hold the same values, right? To be able to feel supported in that space, that kind of thing. So it's really important to think about as you move through the work, what do you need? That could eventually lend itself to what career you choose, or job position you end up in. What kind of work environment is going to best support you to be the most effective person, right? To really flex your muscles. Okay, then the last question about our internal climate is kind of knowing who you are, or at least the things you jotted down, knowing what you need to tend to that. What's going to be better because you did those things during the work? What will be better? Or what will get better, or maybe like what will stay the same, or how is that going to actually benefit you? So I know that because of who I am and the little bits that I've shared with you and kind of what you know about me, if I do my best to tend to myself while I'm doing the work, if I put myself in intentional spaces, I know that at the end of the day, I can sustain myself in this work, right? I might not face burnout, or I might not be triggered by what somebody says, or, I'm essentially tending to my well-being and therefore can be capable of continuing to contribute, right? I can sustain myself in this work. And I also can identify how other people can help support me, right? This goes back to the community care, right? I'm able to offer myself or offer my ideas to community agreements, or how to build a report or plan, that's going to maybe bring say electric metro buses to this particular area to lower diesel pollution. I'm throwing out a big example, but in that report, the way it gets done is going to be reflective of who the people are, right? What they need and what kind of things need to be sustained throughout the work to make sure that it's actually going to be like a positive benefit, right? It's not going to be at the expense of one person or another. So this is a reflective exercise that I offer to you. This is just yours to keep. That was your moment in your day. And it's something that you can continue to do as you kind of, grow in this work, grow as you are, or wherever you go. Just know that it's a really simple exercise you can do. And I wish there was someone out there who, when I was sitting in your seats, kind of give me the space to kind of figure out my own identity, because sometimes it can be all up here. And when we start to jot it down on paper, sometimes visually looking at it can be really helpful. So that was my gift to you. But why is it important? So when we think about our own identity, the I, once we kind of better understand that, then we can be a little bit stronger moving towards the we, right? The collective, okay? And often I think we focus a lot on the collective because we know it's going to take so many of us to solve that big complex problem. Put a name on it, it's probably going to be a complex problem. So in this space, and then now for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to step away from the I and move towards the we, and that will be the context for how we'll think about the rest of this time together in the presentation. So let's think about like this common ground in this space collectively. What do we have that aligns, right? What is our what do we have collectively shared among us?
An incredible view of water.
Okay, so we all have an incredible view of all
Maybe the
this.
people online now.
Maybe the people, maybe there's a window, hopefully there. Is everyone here an environmental studies major? I'm seeing some nods, I'm seeing some head shakes. Okay, by a show of hands, do we love our environment? Do we just love Earth? Okay, let's start there. Simple as, okay? Sometimes we don't have to make this so complicated. So we all love our environment. We all probably have various reasons of why we love our environment, but for now, that will be our common ground and I can work with that. Okay, so moving from the I, let's talk to the we. Why do we love our environment and why does this matter? Okay, common ground. So this is our common ground. And I'm setting this up because now I'm going to take us through some complex things that's going to require us to step into a brave space, right? Together, we only have this one world, but we know to kind of get to maybe that like beautiful environment where it's beautiful everywhere. There's like no disproportionate impacts. There's no like burden of pollution, all these things, it's like beautiful some places and there's other areas that don't have that same, benefits to access of nature, trees, green canopy, clean water, all those like very serious issues. We have to ask ourselves, why is that? and there are barriers in our way. And I think that does start with that identity work, who we are as people. And let's talk about that. There's a quote that goes something like this, and I apologies, I can't remember who said it, but it talks about how we treat ourselves is how we treat our environment, right? And this quote is really important because it's getting a little bit about how through time, people in our environment have grown a little bit disconnected. I'm talking generally, I'm not saying anyone in this space, but has grown separated, right? And we know that there's big players at play who are driving toxic pollution, right? They're driving forest devastation. They're driving things that are impacting many of our communities in a negative way. So therefore, how I'll say some people may be treating our environment is a reflection of how we treat ourselves. And this, do you see where I'm going with that? It's like, because we're innately connected, what we do to our environment is what we do to each other. And let's talk about why that may be. And then we'll go into kind of solutions-based thinking. From my worldview, it very much starts with white supremacy culture. I know that's a big phrase I just threw at you, but we're going to meet it with some lightheartedness, okay? The purpose of this conversation is to kind of introduce you to this and weave it into our conversation today. We're not going to fully unpack it, but I'm going to present it in some ways of characteristics, okay? And when I say white supremacy culture, I'm not talking about white people. I'm talking about it as a whole culture, right? There are characteristics. So it's not like the fish that are swimming in the water. It's the water that we all swim in. This is very much in the context of the United States and colonialism and the erasure of many cultures, right? Many ways of tending to the environment. And we know in our history of the United States, there was one culture that became dominant, right? And the ripple effect has been so immense. And we know that it is impacting our environment and also the way we impact or treat each other, okay? So it's the water that we swim in, this culture. Some characteristics of this culture that I'll offer to you, and there are many, but I just kind of chose these couple that maybe we can relate to as people who love our environment. So just to introduce it, white supremacy culture refers to the ways white people, and for the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to kind of speak like earlier colonial kind of times. Their traditions, attitudes, and ways of life have been normalized in most of Western society. Keyword most. Okay, so we know that with the onset of colonialism, we can see the impacts of that even in our own Seattle area, specifically the Duwamish River, where there was a community now known as Georgetown, South Fork, the traditional homelands of the Duwamish people, have been living there since time immemorial. But in the early 1850s, the leaders of what we now know today as Seattle decided they wanted to turn the Duwamish River into a worldwide commerce area, the Port of Seattle, right? Even though the community all along said, no, 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 that's not our way of doing. That's not what we want. But it happened anyway. Why? Why did that happen? So this is where I start to introduce like some power imbalances and dynamics and leading with one dominant culture, right? One lens, one way of seeing the world. And therefore, our disconnect, people in the environment, those folks who are saying, let's build a port, we're thinking about like nature or like kind of natural things. I'm making these distinctions just to make a point or natural, like kind of wild environment as our relatives, right? There are many examples in traditional ecological knowledges or indigenous knowledge systems talking about how our trees, our plants, our wildlife, they're our relatives, right? There are other cultures who believe that, oh, those things are our resources, right? They are for our use in extraction. And there's many more examples there. So I bring that to you as a way of kind of demonstrating how what can happen when only one culture or kind of one dominant worldview leads. It ignores everybody else. And then we see this kind of ripple right throughout the history of our environment or our environmental studies. So common characteristics that are pervasive throughout our personal relationships, institutions, and systems, right? It had an immense ripple effect. We're all swimming through this together. That said, white supremacy culture poses more significant harms to communities, mainly Black, Indigenous, folks of color, refugee, migrant families, non-English speakers, just folks with different cultures, different ways of beliefs. And because of this, you see that you see one dominant culture thriving more than others, right? And this creates a power imbalance. What would it look like to stop that power hoarding, share that power, and level out the field so all of our cultures have space to thrive together, right? To lead with multiple ways of doing. So here I'm kind of just introducing different framing of how we can think about things. So in this way, I'm offering that not one culture should be dominant, right? What does it look like to level the playing field, have space for all of us, right? Even just to open up and have a conversation of what that could look like. Sometimes that doesn't even happen. Okay, more kind of specific characteristics can look like preferences held by those with the most power. Those become requirements, right? Who said I had to do what and why? Again, leading with curiosity. And that those who may, fail to adopt these requirements or characteristics by those who are most in power are seen as flawed, right? Or are seen as doing the wrong thing. That's not a very good feeling. And therefore we might be left feeling like we're not thriving while someone else is. That's not fair. And so kind of when we see this happening, it means that we're limiting ourselves from growth, change, and progress, right? If we're not able to kind of recognize how we share space and how we can take other folks' ideas into account. What would it look like if in 1850, right, those who wanted to build what we know today as the Port of Seattle decided, oh, maybe we won't. Maybe we'll take these other kind of ideas or ways of treating our environment into consideration. Would there be a different story? I think there would. And we know that's true because we're seeing it happen today as we continue to heal those harms. So when you might recognize that there's a cultural characteristic at play, there's an opportunity for us all to step away from that, right? To all just walk away from it and say, actually, we want to present doing it this way, where maybe you have to challenge that a little bit, but at least you can offer another way of going about it. Maybe it's something that your culture believes in doing. Lead with that. And when we step away from these characteristics, we can then start to level the playing field. And over time, hopefully, white culture is no longer the dominant culture, right? There's space for all of us. Another example is that the idea that anything can be free of flaws, right? You might know this as perfectionism. We're stepping away from perfectionism immediately. When we kind of think that things can be free of flaws, perfect, it's pretty much an unreachable standard in my worldview that forces us to believe that nothing is good enough, right? This is also sometimes paired with that mindset of scarcity, right? When in actuality, we are all abundant. We're all very much abundant people and have so much to offer because of those imperfections, right? So don't let everyone tell you that, perfect is the way to go, because by not accepting that and stepping away from perfectionism, then you're able to say, yeah, I can learn from my mistake and I can grow from that. You know what I mean? And hopefully you're better for it. Then you're able to celebrate growth, progress from the process. Sometimes we get in sticky conversations about how we're going to, stop Black carbon. And maybe you don't feel like you have the perfect idea, but at least you're trying to make progress in the conversation, even though the people you might be talking to are really intimidating. Next, the assumption that criticism challenges you instead of your idea, okay? I very much believe in systems problems and not people problems. I might have a few people problems, okay? But for the most part, I'm focusing on system problems. And often when we want to challenge something or bring in our own kind of cultural perspective, someone can get really defensive about that. because the automatic assumption is that this person is challenging me. This is something that I think is really interesting, you know? And I think it takes that knowing of ourselves, knowing our identity, what we need to be able to kind of open our minds and say, this person isn't coming at me, they're just coming at my idea, and I can hear them out and I can move through this conversation. That is a life skill that I think that we will all just be working on for the rest of our lives. But just kind of keep that in the back of your head, because an unwillingness to change your mind because you don't want to be right or wrong or challenged, I do think is not a ticket to having a thriving life, right? Sometimes it's okay to feel a little bit challenged depending on the situation. But sharing new ideas and critiques is important because it allows us to innovate, grow, and change and not be hindered from that. Okay. Again, leading to us thriving. Often we have to come up with really bonkers solutions, or maybe they're really simple solutions. And if a person feels challenged because you might see something in your community that you know is going to make people better off, just remind that person that this is an idea. I'm not coming at you, but I'm telling you that this is an idea that I really think has the power to change. Okay, and then the last thing I'll end on is understanding a scarcity mindset. We are all likely to under a scarcity mindset. So looping back to scarcity, we're all unlikely to kind of relinquish our privileges and power for the greater good. What is this actually saying? So like when we feel like we're scarce and we're kind of just like scrapping through life, we'll kind of like take what we can get, or we think that, how do I say this? Like we are, like maybe like your idea isn't good enough, or maybe that you'll just kind of settle for what's at the forefront. Okay. And again, I'll bring in that when we lead with a mindset of abundance, it helps us not only feel empowered in ourselves, but empowered that our idea is really great, and an idea that I am supposed to be here. That imposter syndrome that I'm feeling might be really real, but I'm also an abundant person, right? And I can step into this space and I can own it because I need to be here. Everyone will be better off for it. Okay, so these are the kind of characteristics that I present. And by a show of hands, when we think about our love for the environment, and also the work that we know that needs to get done so everyone can have fair access to the benefits of nature, can we say together that we sometimes see these characteristics come up in our work or in our like kind of like class conversations or that kind of thing? Like, do you ever hear notes of defensiveness, or do you ever hear notes of there can only be one way of doing something? I'm seeing a nod of heads. Yeah, totally, right? So just know that those are characteristics. You can spot them and you can offer another way of doing, another way of going about it, right? Stepping away from this. And that is change in progress. Even though it might like look invisible, it is change in real time. And when you do that, I commend you for it. So then we get to the turn the curve thinking. Okay. So far we've talked about kind of who are we before the work gets started, moving from us to the we collective and what we all care about. But understanding that there are these like very nitty-gritty characteristics caused by our history of the United States that get in our way. But with this knowledge and further research, which I highly encourage, we can recognize that, step away from it, and offer a new way of going about something, or a new way of going about a conversation. Even if it's as simple as doing the hard work and sitting there, encouraging someone else to open up their mind. I call this turn the curve thinking. Okay. So turn the curve thinking, to put simply in a way, say you have a community that is living really close to a highway, and therefore that community is experiencing high rates of asthma. We can ask ourselves, okay, knowing what we're up against, knowing that there might be defensiveness or someone thinking I'm not abundant enough to offer a really good idea, what can I do to turn that curve on this problem, right? And so I call that like a verb, noun, so what equation. Verb being like the action you can take so that the community asthma rates are lower. Verb, noun, so what? So that people can lead healthier lives. And this is a reminder that this work is also very much generational. So this is the turn the curve thinking. And so sometimes I think it's important to go into a conversation without kind of leaving your own agenda behind, because it allows us to kind of think a little bit broader about how we can turn the curve on a situation. Now, knowing that we kind of know, everything that's in the room or this culture that we're swimming in. So I'll pause there. Does anyone have any questions about what we have covered so far? Yes.
Gary told me that he doesn't ask questions. So he's always like wanting to let the students through, but then like, I'm always like the first one with a question. Dang it. I'm learning wisdom.
Okay.
But in the turning of the curve, like there's this great synergy there, something someone else in the speaker series said, which is just really similar. I just wanted to remind you all of the great turning. I don't know if you remember from Jennifer Atkinson's talk, how she was referencing Joanna Macy's work and the idea that we might be involved in a great turning.
A great turning. I love that. I feel like I'm a part of a great turning.
I think you are.
Thank you. And how we can continue that great turn, right? That horse on the wheel, that turn is making sure we're turning away from the things that we know in history have not served us, right? What does it look like to turn the curve with multiple ideas and cultures at play? Making space and making sure that all those cultures are represented as we're working to turn that together. This is what we'll kind of end on. Yeah, go ahead.
And what you're saying, like also nurturing the curve, like
Nurturing the
the curve that's like going on, and like been going on, and then like nurturing that. So like,
Yes, you got the right idea. Absolutely. So the comment was nurturing the curve together, literally as we're doing the work in turning the curve. I'm loving this kind of invisible wheel that we're forming. I think that's really cool. And I also feel like I'm getting a little exercise, which is nice. So that's really important, because this is where we're reminded that we can, as we work to turn that curve together, we can bring joy into the conversation. We can do it in a way in which communities can heal at the same time. Right? Again, not to be extractive, but to nurture each other. Think of each other as relatives and support each other in this work as we continue to turn that curve together, right? This could be as simple as maybe you are planning a meeting on how to, I don't know, move the flight path so airports aren't spreading their ultrafine particulates over communities that are under the flight path. Just to put out a big example. Okay, but at this meeting, you're going to provide the most amazing pupusas you've ever had, daycare, stipends, anyone who participates, and transportation. You know what I mean? So how can we nurture each other as we do the work and have humble conversations while also kind of coming up with the solutions together? You see what I mean? We can nurture each other as we do this. And this has been happening in movements for ages, right? And we can continue doing that. So turn the curve. So here we go. I'll also offer this to everybody. Very much in a conversation, kind of conversationally based. And this is really top of mind for me because this week I've had so many difficult conversations. To give an example, we had written a public comment letter. I'm very much involved in policy, which is why I'm often in tough conversations, on recommendations for the Washington State Department of Transit. They were writing a mobility freight plan, except in their plan, if you word search for the word public health, you wouldn't have found it. So knowing that there are communities such as South Seattle, such as the neighborhoods of Georgetown and South Park. I don't know if anyone lives there. Okay, such as neighborhoods of Georgetown and South Park, where communities are living along freight lines, right, between two major highways and the Port of Seattle. So for that community, imagine that the State Department's freight plan doesn't mention public health, doesn't mention how in this plan in their 5 years is going to think about how to mitigate the impacts of freight, of diesel, of air pollution in the community. That's like a reason to get like really riled up, am I right? So in this convert, we wrote a 16-page public comment letter with a list of recommendations that are really good, if I do say so myself. And they decide that they want to have a Zoom call with us. During this call, they want to go over our recommendations. And in this call, we were met with a high level of defensiveness. We can't do this, or, you know, this is not in our jurisdiction, a game I like to call ping pong. And we're really getting to a conversation of where like people do not want to be accountable for the things that are in their power, right? In their sphere of influence to change. And so imagine in that conversation, you're like, oh, wow, things feel heated. What am I going to do right now to tend to myself so I can move through this work, knowing who I am, and hopefully leaving this call, maybe opening someone's mind to actually these recommendations are solid. They're, you know, valid. My ideas can contribute to this work, and we are abundant. So therefore, we're going to really try hard. Okay. So a way that we can do this is offering nonviolent communication. This sounds like really dense, and it is. For the purposes of the conversation, we're going to think about it as we are trying to make the environment a better place for everyone, and we know that that's going to take a tough conversation. So how can we do this? This is also a life skill. I don't know, in your personal relationships with family members, and maybe like telling the bus driver that you have to be on this bus right now. Okay, this is me bringing joy into this work. Okay, so we'll start with the nonviolent communication part first, and then talk about what it looks like to maybe decolonialize that. I don't use decolonialize, that word, a lot, but I'm saying it because this is what this source kind of calls it. So for the purpose of this conversation, that's how I'll think about it. And then we'll go into a transformative justice lens. Okay, so then nonviolent communication, also known as NVC, is a communication that explores synthesis of different complexities of empathy, right, and compassion building. Okay, like how can we, if we're met with defensiveness, how can we meet it back with compassion and empathy? How can we ask that person, are you okay? Is something else going on, right? Is what else is here right now that might be coming up for you that I'm getting, you know, this defensiveness? Being curious and asking those questions can often be helpful. And you're leading with empathy and compassion, not that defensiveness back, even if you want to. We'll get to that in a second. It's also recognized that universally humans have needs, right? And these are basic human rights. So we all share a universal set of basic human needs and rights, including things like food, water, shelter, right? There's a commonality, right? We can like humanize the situation and not think of it as a us versus them, you know, again, not our humans or environment, but we're all innately connected. We can all care for each other. And this, you know, obviously depends. And just, yeah, stick with me. So then feelings. Sometimes in the culture that we all swim in, white supremacy culture, feelings are seen as, again, a weakness, something that shouldn't be shared. But my offering to you is that feelings emerge based on whether these needs are met or not, right? And therefore can accelerate that defensiveness. Or maybe you're gonna like feel that in your body and be like, okay, I'm gonna take a second, but I'm gonna come back with empathy and compassion, okay? So this is important because an unpleasant feeling like, you know, sadness, irritation, can indicate that a need has gone unmet. Someone's not getting what they need right now. You might be in a community meeting, you're trying to offer a really great plan, and there's a disgruntled community member yelling at you, okay? They're like, you're from the State Department. Why aren't you doing this work? That reaction is because that person probably feels like their needs aren't being met. This is really important. So how can we do the work, right? Remembering who we are and get what we need while we're doing it. Often the outcome is going to be something where we all can all benefit. And so when that need is met, maybe it brings in a sense of joy or satisfaction. Okay, also strategies. We engage in a variety of strategies to get our needs met, right? That turn the curve thinking, turning the wheel. What strategies are at play? Again, that verb, noun, so what equation. what do we need? What actions should be taken so that, and then hopefully everyone else is better for it. And what sometimes strategies don't align. It happens often. We can acknowledge that. And often conflict can emerge from that, right? It becomes a really sticky issue, something really tense. But if we can find the right strategy, maybe someone calls this consensus or something like that, which we also know is really hard to get to. But if a strategy can be met that is comprehensive of both set of needs, perhaps that conflict will resolve, right? It just takes a long time of getting there. But if you stay in the fire and you have that conversation, and you're encouraging each other to open up your minds, you just might get there. So with these concepts and a few other tools, it offers just insightful ways of how to just constantly reframe and review the language that we're using and the relationship that we're building. Reframe, review, reframe, review, very helpful. So, and an important tidbit here is that it means that we're behaving in ways that are in line with our values and speaking in ways that are authentic to who we want to be in the world, right? This might be inspired by your own identity or the things that you need or that your community needs, right? Aligning values is really important. And I encourage you all to always put yourself in spaces where your values are being aligned. And it's practice and it's a skill. It will take time. It will never be perfect, but we can step away from perfectionism and do our best. So let's put a twist on it. So conventional nonviolent communication does not go as far enough to explore the way that systemic oppression or kind of collective trauma histories change how we talk to each other, right? This is the big power piece. We know that harm has been done. And sometimes someone will say, well, why would I have that conversation when this person represents something that really, really caused harm in my history, okay? And I totally acknowledge that. So here is where the decolonial part comes in. Colonialism took away from us indigenous knowledge, right? Away from shared resources and away from belonging to each other, right? Thinking about that example of the Duwamish River was 15 miles meandering stream. And when those leaders decided they wanted to make it into a worldwide commerce area, they dredged the river into 5 miles of what today is still called a waterway, right? So it took us away from shared resources, from a shared experiences, and completely altered, right, our environment and our relationship to each other. So here, a decolonial lens seeks to explore and deconstruct the ways we have internalized messages of scarcity and othering, right? Such that we can re-engage widely, open-heartedly, and care for one another along with healthy and appropriate boundaries, okay? So this is that piece that if you're kind of thinking of oh, I don't know if I want to have that tough conversation, just know that you can set your own boundaries that you deem appropriate and healthy for who you are representing or the community at which, who you're accountable to, and then you can try to move to that conversation. Okay. So let's bring it all together and then we'll take a quick pause. So moving away from white supremacy culture, we can move forward, maybe using these notions of nonviolent communication, but also thinking about in history, who and what has harmed our environment. And we can set those boundaries. We can align, ourselves with shared values, and we can open our minds, open our hearts, and hopefully lead with empathy and compassion to get toward the solution, right? Not get stuck in the conflict when we might be met with something like defensivism. In this way, we can start to perhaps reimagine our relationships and our values and mindfulness. And hopefully it has a ripple effect, right? It changes. We can tend to turning that curve together, centered in healing for justice and transformative work. The justice piece is really about who is represented and making sure that that's a power that is shared, right? Because we know historically that hasn't always been the case. And thus, leading with an embodied sense of self, right, our own identities, we can reflect the qualities of our environment. Biodiversity, our wonderful biodiversity, teaches us that many complex things can interact with each other, right? It's a reflection of who we can be, and it still serves as a fantastic example of the kind of the sights we continue to reach, or what is that saying, like the stars we hope we can grab or what have you. But do you know what I mean? The example's right in front of our faces, and we can get back to that. Okay. So additional tools that go beyond the conversation are things like you can develop a decision matrix and criteria. I love this, okay? It's basically like a table. And a table, you have like, okay, you have a table, and then you have like your y-axis and your x-axis, right? On the top, you can say my values are transformative justice, equity, accessibility, affordability, and these kind of things, okay? Then you have maybe your suite of solutions, and then you can go one by one and see, do your solutions meet your criteria? Yes, no, maybe so, high, medium, or low, and maybe that helps you kind of get to, you know, that end-all solution. Or maybe if you're working with folks who might not have the aligned shared values, maybe you can come up with a set of criteria to then match to a potential solution, and thus come to a consensus on what might be the best fit. Okay, that was like my 30-second policy analyst preview for you if you want to go to policy school. You can do a power mapping activity. This one looks like a graph, right? When you acknowledge in the middle who really holds the power, okay? A lot, maybe a little, okay? And then you can kind of branch out who are the key participants and their levels of interest. This will let you kind of visually see who you really need to be talking to, right? To maybe help them realize they need to get out of the way, share the power, or lend more resources, right, to the solution. You can do also like a tree diagram or a fishbone. This is personally my favorite. Trees teach us a lot, okay? So I am a tree, right? And I have roots. Roots are, when you identify those roots, those are the things that are really, really hard to change, right? Like the, I don't know, the unjust policies that we know are going to take forever to change. The tree trunk is the environment, so the environmental factors around us. This could be things like the air pollution or the kind of harmful toxics that people are living in close proximity to. Or there's the leaves. These are things that contribute to the situation, but are the easiest levers to change, right? So this could be, I don't know, I'm not really sure, I'm running out of ideas right now, but you can also have your leaves. The way I presented this in the past is answering this question of, why does Sophia have asthma? Or why does someone you know have asthma? So the roots could be access to healthcare, the environment could be the pollution, or the leaves could be maybe like just needs an inhaler, or needs to find a doctor that can speak Spanish, or something like that. When you identify what's kind of happening in the complex problem, you can use models to outline that and therefore tackle those pieces, or assign other people who have power to tackle those pieces, right? And then together you kind of come up with like a collective action plan to act on an issue. Do you see how that works? Okay, cool. You can do mind mapping. There's also this really kind of cool results-based accountability that applies turn the curve thinking, which I think is cool. You can get a certificate program in that, just laying that out there. And then there's more. So here I will pause. Flowers for you. And just ask if anyone have any questions. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a comment about this. I just want to say first of all, thank you for the presentation. I feel like it was the most beneficial presentation I've sat through. We're not sat through, enjoyed.
I'm so glad.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Else say that they don't use the word decolonial or they decolonize.
Yeah.
And I know like their reasoning for it, but I want to know like more about your reasoning for it. So I can put like language to that.
Yeah, totally. I think this is a really good question that I continue to always think about. Oh yeah, the question is, okay, and talking about the word kind of decolonialize, we've heard other people talk about why they don't use that phrase. And so I had mentioned that it's not something that would be my go-to phrase, and why is that? This is a good question and something I am continuously thinking about. For me, I just feel like it's something that I personally can't own yet, because I am still kind of going through my own unlearning. And I feel like as kind of a highly appreciative guest upon our beautiful Coast Salish lands, that I too I can practice perhaps stepping away from characteristics, but I myself have to think about how I might have contributed to the colonization, or do you know what I'm saying? Like the practice of knowing that I myself and my own identity don't identify as an Indigenous person, or at least, yeah, I don't identify as an Indigenous person. So that's simply my reason. And I'd be curious, I don't know, do you have other examples of why other people might not feel free to use that, or feel free to use that kind of phrase or that kind of thing?
Yeah, there was one person said that there's just like other language that's more fitting for it, I guess.
Yeah. Other language that's more fitting. Yep.
Yeah.
And then like true to who you might be in the work that you do.
Mhm.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I personally just don't feel like it's something I can own, and I feel okay saying that out loud. Yeah, go ahead.
So I have a friend right now. I've encouraged so many of my friends to take Environment 100 actually, just for like various reasons.
Okay, you looked up like 50 new spots, so all your friends can join.
I don't have that many friends, but so I have a friend right now who identifies as a straight white male, and he's really struggling in our class with sort of the guilt that comes along with like just acknowledging that it's predominantly that demographic that has contributed to climate change. And so every time I have conversations with him about the environment, obviously environmental studies is not his major, it's not his interest.
Yeah.
So for me, it's like I deal with those things that I'm happy to deal with and kind of contemplate a lot of that, especially being a white person myself. But like he doesn't spend the time to do that, like because obviously like his focus is in other areas. And so like when I talk with him, I met with a lot of like defensive reasoning, and he sort of then starts to take everything as like, oh yes, I'm so sorry for climate change. Like he turns it into almost like a joke, for lack of a better word. And I'm sort of wondering if you have any advice on how to kind of communicate with people who are struggling and, aren't spending the time the way that I or some of my other friends are to kind of deal with those sorts of things.
That is a great question. I love this. I'm going to try to rephrase this. Okay. Simply put, we've had experiences with people that we know who, because of their own identity, particularly cis white males, might be feeling guilty, but also might not be taking the issue very serious, right? And be willingness to hear and kind of understand the offerings that are at their fingertips, right? To be a part of this collective work. I do a good job just summarizing it, but I hear 100% what you're saying. So a couple of things here. I think it's really important to think of things like not in like a monolith, right? In that when we talk about like community, we know that there's so much wrapped up in that. And when we talk about white people, we have to make sure that we're not thinking about that as a monolith. My mother is white, and let me tell you, she set the bar so high. Okay. And so it's something that where I'm going to kind of answer your question in not white people, but this like concept of whiteness, and knowing that whiteness benefits so many of us for so many different reasons. I will speak from personal experience. Some of my best friends are cis white males who are actively doing the work. And so I think it's one thing to like feel guilt, but what does it mean to like feel guilt and not also be have willingness to change or to be a part of the work in some way? And there are various levels of participation, right? You can be informed, you can participate, you can be actively involved in the decision-making process, you can be organizing your own things. Like there is a variety of ways to plug in. The way I see it is that at the end of the day, all of us are impacted in some way by climate change. It's inescapable at this point, unfortunately. And so I think that it will probably be a matter of time for your friend until he will kind of see the light and understand that he's also a part of the solution. And I think it's inevitable, to be honest. And I think that there are so many resources, there are so many interactions in our world where he will learn. And I think that he will learn that even if he wants to get a job, he will have to demonstrate, right, how he's doing this work. For example, there are a lot of job positions now that ask questions around diversity, equity, inclusion, about anti-racism and justice, around how are you going to facilitate a conversation leading with an anti-oppression lens, right? He's going to learn that he has to do this work. And in this way, he'll also learn, hopefully in the process, are you recording this? Because you can send this to your friend. I'm just kidding. But yeah, but at some point, people might decide that, hey, I don't want to hang out with you anymore because we don't really share values. You know what I mean? We're not really aligned. And that can't happen. Many of us have decided that we are going to move away from relationships or friends or, you know, different dynamics because those people don't share our values. And that's totally okay. And so I think that you set your own boundaries and how much you want to offer. But at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, like, sometimes this is not our work to do, and our energy is better spent in other areas. And eventually, that person will meet a moment where they'll say, wow, I really actually need to do this work because it's going to be required of me, or for a whole other set of factors. That's the kind of the best thing I can offer at the time. I'll give another example. Washington State just passed the Healthy Environment for All Act, the HEAL Act, which is a law in Washington State that certain state departments have to have an environmental justice plan, right? In whatever future planning or process they set, they have to basically do that environmental justice work to advance justice in communities. And so if your friend ever wants that kind of job or position, they're going to have to learn that, oh, wow, it's required of me by the law, right, to do this. And I will say there's a lot of folks very similar to your friend in state agency positions who are really grappling with that and learning that they're going to have to bring in new knowledge and recommendations from folks that look like me, essentially, or other folks who are very well versed in this to then be able to be successful in their work. You know what I mean? Yeah. I don't know where we are on time, but I'll keep taking questions.
Yeah, it was just kind of like a comment on what you said and on what you said as well.
Mhm.
Just like, I feel like in situations like that, it's like already an identified like truth with that person. I feel like, and I feel like the like ability to, or like the tendency towards defensiveness is because like in a situation where you would not know that truth, I feel like you would be kind of like, oh, what? But since you've like identified it as some level of truth, you're like defensive to it, and you like haven't identified like, and I feel like it's like claiming that truth. I don't know if that made sense, but like I feel like we all know like on some level of truths that like underflow, like we learned about our presentation. Yeah, and like that defensiveness only occurs when you're like pushing against something rather than like you haven't identified it at all.
Absolutely. And it can be an indicator that you're making progress.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And like, one just quick comment on that is that, you know, I think it's a tough space and that your friend is in, and I have empathy for that space. And I think that, you know, something that I think can be really powerful is to be able to find other cisgendered white men who are also grappling with these same issues, to be able to talk about it. There is not enough language that we give, any of us get in our training, learning
Right.
on how to grapple with the hardness of these things. And we especially, I think it might be fair to say that cisgendered white men might be especially depauperate in the language that is needed to process this grief, and that maybe your friend is actually doing the best that he can do, which is he just needs more support in how to do that. And like, I don't know, that's just another framing.
And that's what the
That's a tough spot.
nonviolent like communication shows us, is that so much of it is that potentially there's a need not being met. And that need could be having like the emotional vocabulary, right, to have the conversation. And because maybe, oh, I don't know what to say or where to go, it turns into something funny, turns into a joke, and that kind of thing. And so maybe you could say, I don't know, is there something coming up for you right now? Maybe is this what you mean to say? You know, just like put your offerings out there. I do appreciate how you're trying to work on your friend. I do believe that in your spheres of influence, you can go, you know, like talk to your people and do that. But again, make sure you set your own boundaries. I had a really good friend, we went to Evans School together for graduate school, who did something what Eli is talking about and setting up a group for, his close friends that all identified as white. But they like kept to their own space, they don't bring anyone down or into that, and just recognize that they just need that space to be able to move through it and expand their emotional vocabulary. So yeah. Good question. Anything else? Oh, I was wondering what your thoughts are on working on learning communication skills in the field, and I can't see the rest.
Field of therapy. I've always seen therapy as a very favorite phenomenon in our society. The work should come on with the field. I have always had a very difficult time finding ways to interact with therapy because of inaccessibility. But I have the resources to clear the decolonial lens is the impact that white supremacy, colonialism, capitalism are at the center for a lot of my trauma, and why the circumstances to my trauma exist in the first place. So I guess I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how to interact with systems like therapy, which so often have this clear impact of cultural forces which play a role in our emotions.
Ooh, that's a really good question. Okay, so the questions in the chat, and then for the group, it's talking about how, how therapy, how do I replace this? It's such a good question. What I'll respond to is how, what does it look like to tend to ourselves? And therapy is often seen as a space where it's a space for you, and we can receive expert help, and kind of ways through our thinking, and maybe like mind mapping on how to work through trauma that we have either inherited or trauma that has happened to us. And I'm forgetting the top part of this question, but I'll just go to say that I think anyone who approaches therapy, power to you. But we also know that, yes, it can be highly inaccessible. Even finding a person that we can relate to can be really, really tricky, right? Maybe it's also the access, whether your insurance covers it or you have to pay out of pocket. That can be really, really conflicting. I will just offer that it doesn't just have to be therapy it doesn't have to be a siloed space, right? What would it look like for, I don't know, programming environment or environmental studies to kind of incorporate this more kind of like thought, I guess, I don't know how, maybe you already do now, but more kind of thoughtful based learning that maybe you are talking to your academic advisor about it, but you can also go to your professor and talk about it. We learned in the pandemic that so much is intertwined, right? We learned that we had to be therapists and professors at the same time. We learned that we had to be students and also, caretakers. We learned that there's just more than one thing going on. And so I would just say that we can explore the opportunities to incorporate conversations where we can have a safe space and a brave space, right? To just have vulnerable moments where we just put it out there, such as like what we did today. And it might not be, personal or direct to you, but what would it look like to incorporate it in our conversations? Because it's a path towards also focusing on healing as we do the work. So that's what I offer. And I admit, I don't really have like the complete knowledge base to maybe give you what you need right now, but I hope maybe that's an offering of something that you can advocate for, or maybe write a letter to incorporate what you are seeking more throughout your everyday and not just in that like therapy space if it does feel inaccessible.
Wow.
I'll send you all my slides. I have a bunch of slides that have just more kind of examples and kind of more environmental related things, and you'll